It began on a morning when the war should have been over for them. A line of exhausted German soldiers, mud on their boots, fear in their eyes, uniforms worn thin from months of retreat, walked slowly toward an Allied outpost. Their rifles hung upside down, slung from the barrel, a universal sign of surrender. Their hands were raised. Their faces carried the same question: would they be shown mercy or contempt? This wasn't Germany. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a small European town that had seen enough death to fill a century. The townspeople watched from shattered windows and broken doorways. Some had lost brothers. Some had lost homes. All had lost something to this war. And now, right in front of them, marched the very men who represented everything that had taken it away. The Germans expected shouting, stones, spit, revenge. What they received was worse, and far heavier: silence. An entire street full of civilians simply stepped aside. No words, no curses, no gestures of welcome, and none of hatred either. Just a cold, heavy quietness that clung to the air like fog. The surrendering soldiers felt it press against their chests. They had prepared for punishment. They were not prepared for nothingness. Because silence has weight. Silence makes a man hear everything he has done. Silence forces him to face himself. Some of the younger Germans trembled, not from fear of being shot, but from the realization that these people, these wounded, grieving civilians, were choosing dignity over vengeance. And dignity can hurt far more than anger. One soldier later wrote in his diary that the silence felt like a mirror held to the soul. Another wrote that it was the first moment he understood what his uniform truly meant. The war had taken years to build. That moment took seconds to redefine it. The silence that greeted those surrendering soldiers did not appear out of nowhere. It was the final echo of years that had reshaped Europe beyond recognition. To understand that moment, one must go back to the winter before the war's final collapse. When armies were still moving, borders still shifting, and ordinary people were still trying to survive inside the rubble of history. It was early 1945. Germany's defeat was no longer a question of if, but when. The Allies were closing in from the west. The Soviets were advancing from the east. Entire divisions had been reduced to scattered groups of men, many barely old enough to shave. Town after town fell, not with the thunder of glorious battle, but with a tired sigh of populations who had nothing left to lose. And amid this collapse were the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, some fiercely loyal, some simply trying to stay alive, others already aware that they had been fighting for a cause that had turned to ash. Many were starving. Many were frostbitten. Many had started to whisper the word surrender not as a disgrace, but as a doorway to survival. Across Europe, villages that had been occupied for years were beginning to awaken. People who had lived under curfews, ration cards, confiscated farms, and the constant fear of interrogation were seeing German convoys retreat for the first time. Liberation was not a moment of celebration. It was a long breath finally being let out. In one such region, tucked between forests and riverbeds, lay the town that would later welcome those surrendering soldiers with silence. It was not a famous town. No great battle had been fought there. But it had endured the same unspoken wounds that thousands of European towns endured. Its church bells had not rung in years. Its marketplace had become a place to barter scraps of bread. Its children had learned to recognize the footsteps of patrolling soldiers before they could write their own names. The occupation had been strict but not always murderous. Yet the fear had lived in every corner. A missing loaf of bread. A rumor of listening to forbidden radio broadcasts. A late return home after curfew. Small things that could mean jail or worse. The townspeople had buried their anger deep. They had learned to swallow outrage, to quiet themselves, to adapt. Surviving meant understanding that emotion was a luxury, and hope was dangerous. So they kept their words inside. By early 1945, the sound of retreating German trucks had become more common. But retreat didn't mean peace. When an army collapses, discipline collapses with it. Looting increased. Deserters roamed the countryside. Highway thieves disguised as soldiers preyed on civilians. And the people in this town, caught between retreating Germans and approaching Allies, braced for the uncertainty of whatever would come next. The Allied commanders knew this region was fragile. They knew that a sudden surge of desperate German soldiers could lead to violence. So they ordered small units, often Americans or British, to advance cautiously, offering safe surrender to any German troops willing to lay down arms. For many Wehrmacht soldiers, these Allied outposts became lifeboats. For the civilians, they became the first sign of stability. The surrendering group that walked toward the town that morning had once belonged to a larger regiment. Weeks of retreat had whittled them down to a few dozen. Their officer had thrown away his map days earlier. Their ammunition was nearly gone. Their rations were gone entirely. When they crossed the forest ridge and saw the outskirts of the town, they made their decision. But what they did not know was this. The townspeople had heard them coming. They had gathered quietly, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. This was the moment they had waited years for. The moment when those who had controlled their lives would finally stand powerless. Some expected to feel relief. Some expected to feel rage. Most felt something else entirely, an exhaustion so deep it reached the bone. Punishment or mercy? Anger or restraint? They had imagined this moment countless times during occupation. Yet when it arrived, the town chose something neither side expected. A silence thicker than any word. A silence shaped by grief, not hatred. And that silence would tell the surrendering soldiers more about the world they had helped break than any shouted insult ever could. When the German soldiers stepped into that silent street, they believed the worst had already passed. Their rifles were surrendered. Their officer had raised a white cloth torn from a shirt sleeve. Their boots dragged with each step. They were ready for captivity, ready for judgment, even. But what they didn't know was that surrender is only the beginning of a far more complicated reckoning. And this town, bruised by years of occupation, held its own unspoken memory of who these men were. For the Germans, the walk down that road felt endless. For the civilians, it felt like facing ghosts they had never been allowed to challenge. The first escalation began with the tension between expectation and reality. The German soldiers expected rage. The civilians expected justice. Both sides received something neither understood: silence. At first, the German officer misread it. He thought it might be calm acceptance. Then he looked closer. Mothers holding children who no longer cried. Elderly men standing with the stiffness of those who had buried sons. Young women staring with a mixture of defiance and a pain too old for their age. It was not silence of peace. It was silence of scars. The soldiers' steps slowed. No one dared breathe too loudly. Each of them knew that in war, hatred is predictable, but dignity is unsettling. It forces self-reflection that no punishment can offer. One young soldier, barely 18, felt his throat tighten. Weeks earlier, he had marched through a different village where the crowd had screamed insults. Stones had been thrown. A comrade had been struck. Chaos had broken out. Facing fury had been easier than this quiet reckoning. Here, people did not throw anything. They simply stared. And that cut deeper. The Allied unit assigned to take the surrender stood behind the crowd, observing the exchange with wary discipline. They had seen civilians lash out at prisoners before. They had seen vengeance break loose instantly after liberation. But this town showed no violence. Only a controlled, collected coldness that even the Allied soldiers didn't expect. Still, they prepared for escalation, because silence can ignite as quickly as anger. The German prisoners were ordered to form a line. They obeyed. Every motion was stiff, cautious. Their officer approached the Allied commander, offering his remaining papers with shaking hands. The commander didn't speak much. He simply nodded, took the documents, and told the Germans that they would be processed and moved to a temporary camp. It should have ended there. But war never ends neatly. The tension rose when a middle-aged man stepped out from the back of the crowd. His coat was torn, his beard untrimmed. His hands clenched into fists he tried to keep steady. He had lost 2 sons in the early occupation, one taken as a laborer, the other shot while trying to flee. Their graves were somewhere beyond the forest, unmarked. He walked toward the line of Germans, not with fury, but with the heaviness of someone who had carried grief like a stone for years. The Allied commander moved as if to block him, but stopped when the man lifted an empty hand to signal peace. The German soldiers tensed. The townspeople held their breath. The grieving man stopped before a young German private. The private lowered his gaze, not out of respect, but because he could not bear to meet the eyes of this man who had lost everything. The civilian spoke quietly, too quietly for most to hear. "You took my sons." The German soldier didn't respond. He couldn't. He didn't know which action, which patrol, which order had led to the loss. Maybe none. Maybe all. In war, responsibility spreads like dust. It settles on everyone. The private's lips trembled. He whispered, "I'm sorry." Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a small, breaking apology that escaped despite training, fear, and pride. Some of the civilians gasped, not because the apology was surprising, but because they had forgotten what apologies sounded like. Under the occupation, apologies came only from the oppressed, never the occupiers. The grieving man stared at the soldier, searching for something: remorse, truth, meaning. He saw a boy wearing a uniform that symbolized everything he hated, yet the boy himself looked too fragile to even lift the weight of that symbol. After a long moment, the man stepped back. Not forgiving, not confronting, just retreating into the silence he had mastered long ago. And that silence returned, thicker now. But the real escalation came after the prisoners were escorted to the edge of town. Because once they were out of sight, the civilians began to speak. For the first time in years, their whispers rose above the weight of fear. Some argued that the soldiers deserved punishment. Some believed the war was ending, and vengeance would only bring more sorrow. Some feared that a single spark could set the entire region ablaze again. The Allies, too, debated among themselves. Many soldiers had lost brothers, fathers, or friends in battles against German forces. Processing prisoners peacefully was part of discipline, but emotions are never simple during war's final days. No one trusted that the quiet would last. And they were right to be cautious. That night, after the surrender, news spread that another group of German soldiers, this one larger, more desperate, and less disciplined, was approaching from the northern woods. Unlike the first group, they were not looking to surrender peacefully. They were hungry, scattered, and frightened. They had already looted a farmhouse the previous day, and they believed that the only path to survival was to push through whatever villages stood in their way. For the town, this was the true test. The silence they had given the first group had been a decision born of dignity. But dignity alone would not protect them from chaos. The civilians gathered in the town hall, discussing whether to hide, flee, or trust the approaching Allied forces to defend them. The memories of occupation had already left them wary. Now desperation hung in the air like a storm. Meanwhile, the first group of surrendered Germans, now prisoners, heard about the second group approaching. Some grew frightened. They knew what hungry, cornered soldiers were capable of. They also knew that if violence erupted, they too might be blamed. And in the middle of all this, the Allies prepared for a confrontation they hoped would not come. The war was ending. But endings are rarely smooth. Sometimes the last days are the most dangerous. The silence of the town had been a powerful act. But now the question was whether silence could hold back a storm. Night settled over the town like a lid closing on a fragile box. Candles were dimmed. Windows were shuttered. Every person, from the oldest villager to the youngest child, felt the weight of uncertainty settle in their chest. The first group of Germans had surrendered without violence. But the second group, the desperate, scattered, hungry men moving through the forests, were a different story entirely. The Allies knew these final days of war could be the most unpredictable. A broken army behaves like a wounded animal, unpredictable, frightened, and quick to lash out. The Allied commander ordered his men to take positions around the outskirts of the town. They were few in number, but they were disciplined. Their goal was simple: prevent chaos. The surrendered Germans, held under guard in a makeshift camp near the river, listened anxiously to bits of information whispered between the Allied soldiers. Some sat curled in their coats, knees pulled to their chests. Others stared into the darkness as if expecting their former comrades to emerge at any moment. One of them, the young private who had whispered, "I'm sorry," earlier, couldn't sit still. He paced in small circles, wringing his hands, haunted by the thought that the approaching band of soldiers might commit violence in the town he had just walked through. He kept seeing the eyes of the grieving man, eyes that held pain deeper than hate. And for the first time since being drafted, he felt the stirrings of something he had never been allowed to feel while wearing that uniform. Responsibility. Responsibility not to a command, not to a regime, but to the people whose lives had been trampled by the machinery of war. Near midnight, the Allied scouts returned with urgent news. The second group was close. A few dozen men. Disorganized. Armed but poorly. Hungry enough, frightened enough, angry enough to do anything. The Allies prepared their defensive line. The townspeople gathered in basements and cellars, listening for footsteps, breaths sharp with dread. They had lived through occupation. They had lived through retreating soldiers. But this moment, this final threat, felt like a test of whether their long suffering would spill into violence or be swallowed by courage. Then something unexpected happened. A German sergeant from the surrendered group asked to speak with the Allied commander. He was older than most, with lines carved deeply into his face from years of cold and fear. He explained that he knew the approaching soldiers. They had been part of his battalion months earlier. They were frightened men, not monsters, but panic had twisted them. The commander remained firm. "We can't trust prisoners with weapons," he said. "I'm not asking for weapons," the sergeant replied. "I'm asking for a chance to talk to them." It was a dangerous idea. Desperate men do not always listen to reason. But the sergeant insisted. He said it might prevent bloodshed. He said he understood them better than any Allied soldier could. For a long moment, the commander stared at him, weighing the risks. Finally, he nodded. But the sergeant would be escorted, unarmed, flanked by Allied soldiers. If the situation turned, they would act. The young private begged to go with him. He felt, deep in his bones, that this was his chance to do something, anything, to balance the scales of what his uniform had represented. The commander hesitated, then granted permission. So under the cold moonlight, two surrendered German soldiers, once enemies, walked at the center of a small Allied patrol toward the forest road where the desperate group was expected. When they reached the clearing, the second group emerged like shadows. Fists tight on rifles. Eyes frantic. Faces hollow. They saw the Allied soldiers and nearly opened fire. Until they saw the sergeant. He stepped forward, hands raised, completely exposed. The younger soldiers recognized him. He'd been their superior. A strict but fair man. A man they once respected before the war shattered every sense of stability. He told them the truth. He told them Germany was finished. He told them surrender was survival, not shame. He told them the town behind him was armed with nothing but grief. Grief that would only deepen if violence broke out. And then he said something none of the Allied soldiers expected. "I have surrendered. And I am still alive." The younger soldiers faltered. Their fingers loosened around their triggers. They were tired. They were hungry. They were afraid. And suddenly, for the first time, they saw a path that didn't end in bloodshed. But one man in the group, a corporal who had seen his own brothers die, refused. He raised his rifle at the Allied commander. The tension snapped. Fingers twitched. Every heart pounded. Before a single Allied soldier reacted, the young German private stepped forward. "No," he said, not loud, not dramatic, just firm. "You aim that rifle, and everything we suffered becomes meaningless." His voice cracked. Not with fear. With conviction. The corporal's arm trembled. The rifle wavered. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then the corporal lowered the weapon. One by one, the rest followed. In that quiet clearing beneath the moon, the second group surrendered. No bullets. No screams. Just a long, exhausted exhale from men who finally stopped running. The Allies gathered their weapons. The prisoners walked silently into custody. And in the town behind them, people slept through what could have been another tragedy but instead became the final turning point. The war hadn't ended everywhere yet. But here, in this fragile town, the last spark of violence had been extinguished by courage, not cruelty. The next morning, sunlight crept over the rooftops of the town, revealing a quiet that felt different from the silence of the day before. It was no longer the silence of fear, or restraint, or old wounds holding their breath. It was the silence that comes after danger has passed, the silence of exhausted relief. Word spread slowly that the second group of German soldiers had surrendered peacefully. At first the townspeople didn't believe it. Peaceful surrender was a phrase that had become rare in the late war. But when the Allied commander confirmed it, a new feeling settled across the town. Not joy, not celebration, not triumph. Something gentler, something uncertain. Something like the first fragile steps of healing. The surrendered Germans, both groups now combined into one guarded column, were prepared for transport. They stood quietly, heads down, aware of the eyes watching them from doorways and windows. But the atmosphere had changed. The civilians no longer looked at them with the raw wound of yesterday. The silence remained, but it had softened. The young private saw the grieving man again, the one who had whispered his sorrow, the one who had received that trembling apology. For a moment, their eyes met. No words were exchanged. There was no embrace, no forgiveness, no dramatic reconciliation. But there was a shift, almost imperceptible, like a weight being set down between them. Sometimes closure is not spoken, it is recognized. As the prisoners were escorted away, the townspeople emerged from their hiding places. The church bell rang for the first time in years. Not as a victory bell, but as a signal that life could resume, that the rhythm stolen by occupation might slowly return. Children stepped out into the street, unsure at first, then running with an energy that had been denied to them for too long. Shopkeepers unlatched their doors. Farmers returned to their fields. A town that had learned to live in shadows stepped cautiously back into the light. For the German prisoners, the road ahead was uncertain. They would be taken to camps, interrogated, processed, and eventually, if lucky, returned to a homeland they no longer recognized. But something had changed in them as well. The silence of the town had done what lectures and punishments never could. It had forced them to confront a truth. War leaves behind more than ruins, it leaves behind people who must carry its memory. Years later, some of those former prisoners would write about that surrender. Not about the battles they fought or the commands they followed, but about that single moment when a town chose dignity over revenge. They described how the silence pierced them, how it made them question everything they believed about loyalty, duty, and humanity. They wrote about the sergeant who negotiated peace, the corporal who lowered his rifle, and the young private who discovered that courage isn't always found in combat, but sometimes in standing between two worlds and choosing the one that spares life. And the town? It was never famous. No monuments were built to mark that day. No history books recorded its name. But its legacy lived quietly, in diaries, in memories, in the softened hearts of men who entered as soldiers and left as something else entirely. War had taken years to shape this moment. It took only a few seconds of silence to redefine it. And in that silence, the world, just for a breath, remembered what humanity could look like.